was the most important point of our efforts. It has always been my creed that we should not be left as an awful monument to prove that mankind, under the most favorable circumstances for civil liberty and happiness, are unequal to the task of governing themselves and therefore made for a master. Our path to revolution began for us after the completion of the 7 Years' War in 1763. Great Britain was looking for ways to pay for the war debt at our expense. In April of 1769, I wrote a letter to one of my neighbors, George Mason. I had expressed my growing frustrations with our mother country. At a time when our lordly masters in Great Britain will be satisfied with nothing less than the depreciation of American freedom, it seems highly necessary that something should be done to avert the stroke and maintain the liberty which we have derived from our ancestors, that no man should hesitate a moment to use arms in defense of so valuable a blessing on which all the good and evil of life depends, is clearly my opinion, yet arms, I would beg leave to add, should be the last resource. How far then their attention to our rights and privileges is to be awakened or alarmed by the starving of their trade and manufacturers remains to be tried. This was the first time I had made mention of the use of arms in our struggle for freedom. But at this point, it was another weapon that I believe should be used. What I proposed to George Mason was non-importation of British goods. That is what I meant by starving their trade and manufacturers. We would not buy British goods. As I took my seat at the House of Burgesses, the Virginia House of Representatives, my intent was to present the plan to the Assembly. In the May 1769 session of the House of Burgesses, the newly appointed governor dissolved the Assembly. Arrangements were quickly made to meet at a local tavern. It was then that I took papers out of my pocket outlining the scheme for non-importation. It was adopted with a few minor changes. Tension with the mother country only grew worse as the years went by. Regulars were garrisoned in Boston, which led to the Boston Massacre in 1770. As I prepared to attend the Second Continental Congress, I knew that war was looming. I brought my uniform. When I arrived in Philadelphia, I purchased 5 books on the military art. It was in late May of 1775 that we received confirmation at the Congress of the battle at Lexington and Concord. In a letter to George William Fairfax, a close friend I shared, unhappy it is, though, to reflect that a brother's sword has been sheathed in a brother's breast, and that the once happy and peaceful plains of America are either to be drenched with blood or inhabited by slaves. Sad alternative. But can a virtuous man hesitate in his choice? In June, I was selected by the Continental Congress to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. By the spring of 1776, the Army had taken up the defense of New York City on Long Island. Boston had been freed of the siege in March. I was called to a meeting of Congress in Philadelphia in May of that year. Great Britain had sent overtures for reconciliation, making peace on their terms. After all we had been through, I was shocked to learn that some members of Congress were actually considering it. The Virginia delegation was united in separation from Great Britain. After much discussion, the Declaration of Independence was passed on July the 4th. Now, the Declaration of Independence should be celebrated. However, it is one thing to proclaim independence but it is quite another to earn it. You may have heard it said that the Continental Army was without shoes by which their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet. I've seen it. It is true. May we salute those gallant and persevering men who resolved to defend the rights of their invaded country so long as the war should continue. May we never forget their sacrifice. In service to their country, they have acquired to themselves immortal honor. We had several enemies during the Revolution, not just the British. We also faced the enemies of sickness and starvation. More men died due to sickness than from wounds in battle. But throughout the war, hunger was our constant companion. Crop yields throughout the states were more than ample throughout the war, but getting the food to the soldiers was the problem. Under the old form of government, the Articles of Confederation, Congress was unable to impose taxes. Only the states could require taxes from their citizens. Each state was supposed to contribute to the war effort, but the system often broke down and our men went hungry. What was needed was a stronger central government. During the war, it was my habit to send letters to the governors of the states. I would often ask for assistance in these letters. During the last year and a half of the war, I was stationed at Newburgh, close to New York City. It was there that I wrote my last letter to the governors in 1783. It was at Newburgh that it was proposed I should be made king. There was also a mutiny of the officers that almost brought our new country to ruin. In my last letter to the governors, I outlined my vision for our new country and changes in our government that I thought necessary. Here is an excerpt. The great object for which I had the honor to hold an appointment in the service of my country being accomplished, I am now preparing to resign it into the hands of Congress. But before I carry out this resolution into effect, I think it is my duty to offer my thoughts respecting some important subjects and to give my final blessing to that country in whose service I have spent the prime of my life, for whose sake I have consumed so many anxious days and watchful nights. The foundation of our empire was not laid in the gloomy age of ignorance and superstition, but at a time when the rights of mankind were better understood and more clearly defined than at any former period. The treasures of knowledge acquired by the labors of philosophers, sages, legislatures, through a long succession of years are laid open for our use, and their collected wisdom may be happily applied to the establishment of our forms of government, the free cultivation of letters, the unbounded extension of commerce, the progressive refinement of manners, and above all, the pure light of revelation. At this auspicious period, the United States came into existence as a nation. For according to the system of policy the states will adopt at this moment, they will stand or fall, and by their confirmation or lapse, it is yet to be decided whether the revolution must ultimately be considered as a blessing or a curse. Not to the present age alone, for with our fate will the destiny of unborn millions be involved. Whether it be expedient for the states to delegate a larger portion of power to Congress or not, yet it will be a part of my duty and that of every true patriot to assert without reserve and to insist upon the following positions: that unless the states will suffer Congress to exercise those prerogatives, everything must very rapidly tend to anarchy and confusion. That it is indispensable to the happiness of the individual states that there should be lodged somewhere a supreme power to regulate and govern the general concerns of the Confederated Republic, without which the Union cannot be of long duration. There must be a faithful and pointed compliance on part of every state, or the most fatal consequences will ensue. It will be a subject of regret that so much blood and treasure have been lavished for no purpose, that so many sufferings have been encountered without compensation, and that so many sacrifices have been made in vain. At the war's end, I tendered my resignation and surrendered my sword to Congress. It was my intent to retire to my plantation and spend the remainder of my days there. I believed that my duty to my country had been fulfilled. Many were concerned with the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Finally, there was a call for a convention on a new constitution. The convention met from May to September of 1787. I was chosen to be president of the convention. At the beginning of the convention in May, I shared my thoughts with Thomas Jefferson. The business of this convention is as yet too much in the early stages to form any opinion of the result. Much is expected from it by some, but little by others, and nothing by a few. That something is necessary, all will agree. For the situation of the general government, if it can be called a government, is shaken to its foundation and liable to be overset by every blast. In a word, it is at an end. And unless a remedy is soon applied, anarchy and confusion will inevitably ensue. In August, I gave an update on our progress to Henry Knox. The business of the convention progresses, but to say when it will end or what will be the result is more than I can venture to do, and therefore I shall hazard no opinion thereon. If, however, some good does not proceed from the session, the defects cannot be charged to the hurry with which the business has been conducted. I wish a disposition may be found in Congress, the several state legislatures, and the community at large to adopt a government which may be agreed on in the convention, because I am fully persuaded that it is the best that can be obtained at this present moment under such diversity of ideas as prevail. At the completion of the convention, I shared my impression of what was accomplished in a letter to Patrick Henry. I wish the Constitution which is offered had been made more perfect, but I sincerely believe it is the best that could be obtained at this time. And as the constitutional door is opened for amendment hereafter, the adoption of it under the present circumstances of the Union is, in my opinion, desirable. It is interesting to note some thoughts of Mr. Benjamin Franklin, a very fascinating individual. During the convention, he observed the chair that I was sitting in. The back of the chair has engraved on it the sun. You only see the half of the sun. Throughout the convention, he speculated about our new country, and he thought to himself, is the sun rising or is the sun setting on our new country? By the end of the convention, he had concluded that the sun was rising. At the conclusion of the convention in September, the work began to convince the states to ratify the new Constitution. I expressed the need to compromise with Thomas Jefferson. The merits and defects of the proposed Constitution have been largely and ably discussed. For myself, I was ready to have embraced any tolerable compromise that was competent to save us from impending ruin. And I can say there were scarcely any of the amendments which have been suggested, to which I have much objection, except that which goes to the prevention of direct taxation, and that I presume will be more strenuously advocated and insisted upon hereafter than any other. If the system can be put into operation without touching much the pockets of the people, perhaps it may be done. But in my judgment, infinite circumspection and prudence are yet necessary in the experiment. It is nearly impossible for anybody who has not been on the spot to conceive from any description what the delicacy and danger of our situation has been. Though the peril is not past entirely, thank God, the prospect is somewhat brightening. To another I shared, we hope from the general acceptance of the state so far, with small exceptions, in the proposed Constitution, that the foundation is laid for the enjoyment of much purer civil liberty and greater public happiness than have been the portion of mankind before. And we trust the Western world will yet verify the predictions of its friends and prove an asylum for the persecuted of all nations. I would like to share some excerpts from some letters I wrote to the citizens of New York City at the close of the war. America is open to receive not only the wealthy and respectable stranger, but the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation of all our rights and privileges, if by decency and propriety of conduct they appear to merit the enjoyment. My supplications will ever ascend to heaven for the prosperity of my country in general, and for the individual happiness of those who are attached to the freedom and independence of America. To the Hebrew congregation at Newport, Rhode Island, I wrote in part, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of the inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." With the Congress and Senate already in place, I took the oath of office on April the 30th, 1789. Thereafter, the Constitution was put to the test. Now, the first order of business was the formation of the executive departments. Now, the Constitution is somewhat vague. It talks about these executive departments. It talks about the approval of the Senate for ambassadors and for the leaders of these departments, but they are not named. So the first order of business of the first Congress was to name these departments, which of course included the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, the Post Office, and the Secretary of War. It wasn't until some months later that the Attorney General was developed. But there was no mention as to how the president was to interact with the heads of these executive departments. So I realized that as the first president, every step I took, I was on untrodden ground. Everything I did was setting precedent for future presidents. So as I contemplated what to do with the heads of these departments, I turned to my wartime experiences. Now, what I chose to do, which I found to be very successful as general, was the Council of War. I had my staff, the other generals under my command, we would have meetings. The problems of the particular upcoming battle or other issues were discussed. I listened carefully and then made a decision. Also, I would, if there was some distance involved, I would have reports sent to me. As a matter of fact, my running of Mount Vernon, my home plantation, I carried this out throughout the war by letter and receiving reports from the various managers. So the formation of this, the members of these executive departments, I decided it would be best to have the same basic outline as I had done as general. And we would meet as a group and we would discuss the matters at hand. Now, another thing I insisted upon, not only to have men of high caliber, but I wanted a divergence of opinion. I saw no value to only having members or heads of departments that agreed with me. I wanted a difference of opinion. It was then I could get a better sense of the will of the people. And I must say, in passing, that perhaps I was too successful with Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Jefferson. You see, I of course knew that they differed in their opinions, but I didn't know how strongly. There were many bitter fights between the two. Sadly to say, I tried to intervene to try to find common ground, but unfortunately their distance continued to grow. But through the insight of these very learned men, because I must confess that due to the nature of my upbringing, is one of my regrets that I did not get my chance as my older brothers to get a formal education in England at the Appleby School. So I've always depended upon more learned men than myself to help with these matters. So as the government came about, as the administration progressed, some problems came about. First of our dealings was with the various indigenous tribes. Now, it has been my general purpose that I have made plain to various leaders in their interactions with the various tribes, that it is our intent to be peaceful, to form treaties, not to forcibly remove them from their areas. I must confess that it is my desire that they would give up their itinerant life and settle into farming communities, which some have. But overall, I wanted to have a peaceful interaction with the various nations, the various tribal nations. Now, one of my first acts as president was the presenting of a treaty with the Creek tribe. And of course, in the Constitution, it talks about the necessity of the approval of the Senate, but it is not explained how this is done. So I interpreted it that I was to present the treaty to the Senate, and I went to one of their meetings. It did not go well. You see, due to the nature of being a hot summer day, the windows all being open, it was very noisy outside. It could not be heard what I was saying. And it was, I believe, if I recall correctly, it was Mr. Morris suggested that, why not just submit a report? And I thought, well, that defeats the whole purpose of my being here in person. From that time forward, never again was I to go before the Senate. If there was a report, if there was a treaty, I would simply have it sent to them for their own deliberation. Thereafter, future problems with the various tribes developed. You see, Great Britain did not follow through on the treaty. You see, we ended the war with a treaty, and one of the agreements was they were going to leave the various forts, like say, for instance, they have a fort at Detroit in the western areas. They were supposed to leave, to vacate, but they have not. So what they did was to incite the various tribes to provide arms and encouragement to harass the various settlers. So since our overtures at diplomacy had failed, we had to use the military option. And sadly, on 2 occasions, these were complete military failures. The second, he was a very good general in the Revolutionary War, Arthur St. Clair. There's no good way to put it. It was a battle at the Wabash River in the Ohio country, and it was a complete disaster. As a matter of fact, it launched the first congressional investigation as to the reasoning behind the disaster. But thereafter, with the help of another general of the Revolution, Anthony Wayne, he went through a great rigorous training program, which was lacking, which was one of the results of the congressional investigation. He spent many months, a couple of years preparing the men. And this time he had a force 2.5 times, I would say, the original that was sent out. And at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, it was a great, overwhelming victory. And then we were able to negotiate a treaty. So that has been one of the difficulties. And we have also, unfortunately, had at this very early point in our nation, international intrigue. Now, of course, we're all aware of the war in Europe, England and France. This put us in an extremely awkward position. Now, this going back to 1792. You see, we had a treaty with France that had been activated in 1778. And even though the government had changed, that treaty was still in effect. So I went to consult with the Supreme Court as to what we could possibly do. So it seemed the most expedient was to make a proclamation of neutrality. Now, this would not be a treaty, it would be a proclamation. So it was not necessary to go before the Senate as you would with the treaty. In the proclamation, we made ourselves neutral. Now, this and other steps later caused quite a bit of anger amongst our citizens. You see, many are very passionately fond of the French. Now, I too am fond of the French. Let us be very clear. It must be known. We could not possibly have defeated such a power as Great Britain without the help of France, with their navy, with their army, with their armaments, providing uniforms and also providing great deals of money. So I am certainly a great supporter of France. However, it is much too early in our country to get involved in open warfare with Great Britain. There was a great misunderstanding. It was a very close thing. As a matter of fact, it is one of my fears that future generations will think it a myth that we defeated the most powerful empire in the world. I am in a position to know how difficult it was and how close we came on many occasions to disaster. I predict that perhaps in 20 years, we might be able to consider something of that nature. But what was necessary was to start our country at this moment in time and maintain the peace. This became very difficult with the French ambassador, Mr. Genet. He openly tried to recruit involvement in supporting France. Not only that, through the newspapers and so forth, but he took a vessel, a captured British vessel, brought it into Philadelphia and had it fitted for war with cannon. I must confess, I did not have any forces in place to stop his activities. We could not get involved in a war with Great Britain at this point in time. So it was then that I sent John Jay, our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to come up with a treaty with Great Britain to try to alleviate some of our struggles, that to get them to vacate these forts and in the western areas. They had also been seizing our ships. Some 200 merchant vessels have been seized by the British. From their perspective, it is helping the French, these things where we were just trying to be neutral and maintain commerce. So something had to be done to bring about a peaceful resolution. Now, Mr. Jay was not as successful as we had hoped, but he did achieve many things. He was able to get back this the property of these merchants. We were able to get the British to leave, to vacate these forts in the western areas. But many of the country were outraged. They saw this, as I probably confess, that many are still outraged. They saw this as somehow giving in to the British, or not standing up for the French as we should have. But I saw no alternative. And although there are citizens, as I mentioned, to this day are very angry, I am firmly convinced that future historians will consider this one of my greatest achievements of my presidency, to keep us out of this war, which would have brought our country to ruin. And I must also mention at this point that although I've always been firmly committed to the freedom of the press, sometimes I've had my doubts. There have been some very nasty things said in the press in regard to my presidency. You see, one of the statements has been made, of course, Mr. Hamilton has moved on, but you see, I'm senile. Mr. Hamilton, I'm his puppet. He is the puppet master, and he was directing everything in the government. So, but there again, the freedom of the press is very important, and although it is, I must confess, quite uncomfortable at times, it still is a necessary thing. But there must be freedom of speech without restraint, even if, sadly, there is a negative side to it. And then there was the financial development of this country. You see, there is division. I must confess, the Southern planters like myself foresee the future of our country as completely agricultural. There are others, I must conclude myself in this, like Mr. Alexander Hamilton, that foresee manufacturing, finance, and other areas of growth in this country, as well as maintaining a strong agriculture. And of course, this has caused some division, and the formation of the Bank of the United States was a great point of tension. There were those that felt our country should remain agricultural, that felt this was a very bad decision. But then there were those that foresaw, like Mr. Hamilton, that this was the way that our country needed to grow. And of course, the assumption of debt. Now, when I say the assumption of debt, was that the American Revolution cost us some $54 million in debt. Now, some of these states had paid off their debt, others had not. But it's believed that the best answer was for the government, the new government, to assume the debt. Now, of course, the states that had paid for their debt, they were against this because they had already paid off their debt, but then other states had not. But the assumption was passed, and the Bank of the United States was formed, and this was a way to get all the debt contained, and then shares could be sold, and then this could help to start to pay down the debt. But it was not all good. These shares were probably more widely circulated than ever anticipated. And there was the ability to buy a partial share that would lead up to a full share being $400, a partial being $25. The speculators went wild, and these shares, they got huge in value. So finally, there was a collapse, and there was the panic of 1792. And Mr. Hamilton had to put forward government securities to get things back under control again. Now, this was a setback, but I'm nonetheless convinced that the future of our country is not only agriculture. I believe that we will always be strong in agriculture, but there must be more manufacturing, and we must take advantage of the financial markets to have a fully governing system for the world market. So these are some of the struggles we've been dealing with our administration. Now, I understand that there are some questions, and I will be stopping shortly. So if there are questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. But I do have this word of warning that I would like to share that is very important to me, especially as I coming to the close of my administration. The development of factions, political parties, is very unsettling. I believe that it'll be possible. If it would be possible, we shouldn't have political parties. You see, one of the dangers is you divide into these factions, that the needs of the party will be put ahead of the needs of the people. And sadly, I see this growing, this tension. Instead of working together, it seems that there are these factions that are working to, sadly, to break us apart. But to end on a more positive note, I want us to think of what this country can be. We have this new Constitution, and of course, we now have the new Bill of Rights. We should look forward to many good years ahead, and we should think ahead to the unborn millions who will be rewarded through these efforts. So now I'll take this opportunity to do my best to try to answer any questions that may have come up.
President Washington, I have a few questions for you. What was the basis for our U.S. Constitution? Were there writings that had preceded it that the founders used to base the Constitution on, or who can you credit?
Yes, of course, they came from many directions, but if I had to point out one person, it would be James Madison. Very brilliant fellow. At the formation, as it was the weeks leading up to the convention, he knew what was coming. He ordered books from around the world, and if I understand it correctly, he may have had as many as 200 books. Now, when I talk about these are books on political thought and histories and so forth, and he locked himself in a room, and he just devoured these books. And he really put together the outline of the Constitution from these studies. And I have always, when I've had questions, particular questions about the Constitution, I've often turned to Mr. Madison, since I see him as one of the experts on the Constitution. But of course, these ideas were hammered out and polished at the convention. And of course, the very state of our government under the Articles of Confederation was literally falling apart at an end. Something had to be done. But if I was forced, although many people contributed, if I was forced to pick one person, I would have to say Mr. Madison. He made a very significant addition to the Constitution.
We have another question, and this is, if you could foresee into the future, and I know that's very difficult to do, but someone's asking if you could foresee into the future, perhaps a couple hundred years, what would be your opinion of what do you think is going on?
Well, of course, I do look into the future. I believe that a time will come where we will have to interact with Great Britain, and I'm afraid that it will be in a negative light. So I look forward, I see this conflict with France and England, and I foresee that England will prevail. I believe in this particular case that they will be victorious. So that is part of the reasoning behind the Jay Treaty, is that for this time in this country at this moment, I believe it is the best option. Now, in terms of 200 years in the future, my goodness, I can perhaps speculate 20 years, but 200 years, why I can't imagine what will be happening in 20 years. Wow, that would take a greater thinker than myself.
Here's another question. Mr. President, I'd like to know more about your role in the French and Indian War and perhaps how it shaped your military career or your ideas on leadership.
Yes, that was very formative years in my development. Now, of course, I had a bent or a desire for the military from being a young lad. At 14, I was going to run off and join the British Royal Navy, but my mother intervened and put a stop to that. But the desire did not end. Of course, my older brother, who was very much like a surrogate father to me, Lawrence Washington, he served in battle, and he brought back many stories which inspired me. But of course, at the time, I was thinking, when I thought of my country, I thought of Virginia as my country. So when there was an opportunity to send a letter to the French, see, at the time, the French were building and inhabiting areas that was considered to be under the control of Great Britain. So that I was sent by Governor Dinwiddie to personally give a message to the French. And this was a valuable learning experience. I learned about interacting with the various indigenous tribes. I learned about the routes to travel. And of course, I had help. There was a woodsman by the name of Christopher Gist, he actually saved my life, I must say. Without him, I wouldn't be here today, but that's another story. And then, of course, that developed into my command of the need for the Virginia Regiment. I first was lieutenant colonel and then colonel. So the day-to-day needs of a regiment, I learned how to go about it. And I learned a particular style of fighting, a combination of the British system and what we call the backwoods, or how the Indians fight. So together, I had a very highly polished regiment that would be admired by some of the finest regiments of Europe in terms of their skill on the parade ground, but they could also fight in the Indian style. So although I never had experience with a large artillery, I didn't have experience with the use of cavalry, but that knowledge of the involvement in the French Indian War as a young man, that was a very formative period. And it was because of that that at the convention that came later, this being, of course, prior to the war, that I was often looked upon for advice on military matters because of this experience. So it was an invaluable, although at times painful, experience.
Here's another question. It says, what size an acre, or what size farm in acres was required in your day to support a family? And what was the size of your, I guess it was an estate, your estate? What size is your estate, approximately?
Well, the approximate number is about 12,000 acres. Now, of course, when you're farming your own land, you could start very small with a simple garden just to support your family. And of course, that can be very small. But if you want to support your family in terms of having enough produce to not only support yourselves, but to pay for the various things that you need, then of course you have to go beyond a basic garden. Now, in terms of the precise acreage to be a productive farm and self-supporting farm, I have to give that some thought. I don't have a good answer for that.
Another question is, how did you find the strength to carry on during the war when it looked as if your side might be losing? In the winter, and there wasn't enough food, no shoes, and the tide wasn't going your way.
In the end, yes, there were very troubling times. One of the areas, of course, was early in the war. Through the summer of 1776, we started very promising with the victory in Boston. But then we had defeat after defeat after defeat. And then to continue to stay in the fight after that. I must confess that the activity at Trenton was really desperation. I knew that without this roll of the dice, as I shared with my manager, Lund Washington, the game is pretty much up. But then another dark time was in 1780. We had a lot of losses, and it seemed like the war was dragging on indefinitely. So at those times, it was, of course, it was principle. It was, why were we doing this? We were fighting to be independent, and that we felt that the mother country had treated us poorly, and that we did not want to be subservient, that we wanted independence. And also, I must say that I'm not one to consider myself a minister, but I'm certainly, my faith has been a great help to me, my personal faith. But it was really the righteousness of our cause. I firmly believe that our cause was right, and no matter what the setback was, that we must continue on and strive for victory and not give up.
President Washington, can you give us your views on slavery? Slaveholder.
What I would like to do, if I may, this is a very complex topic. If we could answer that at the very end, I would ask you as the host, if you could set aside some time at the end. And I think that this is a topic that requires much discussion.
If there are any other questions from the audience, could you please ask them now, either in the chat box or in the question box? This may be our last question.
Very good. Now, for this question is very complex, and I must say that I will have to come out of character and be John Koopman, because to answer it in first person is very difficult. But let me say this: it is the elephant in the room that people don't want to talk about. But let us talk about it. If you're going to talk about slavery and George Washington, obviously he had slaves. If we're going to put George Washington on trial for slavery, let's consider Exhibits A, Exhibit B, and Exhibit C. Let's look at him in total as a person, as a politician, as a general, as a person. Now, there was, as a case in point, there was a woman back in that time called Judith Sargent Murray. Now, she's considered to have written the first book on feminism in this country. I believe it's called Constantia. Now, she was reviled by a good part of society. However, President Washington not only supported her efforts, but he invited her to a presidential gathering. And just to give you a sense of the feeling toward this lady, she was shunned by all the women at the gathering, with the exception of Martha Washington, who was spent over an hour talking with her. So here's a case in point where we can clearly see that this was considered a negative idea, perhaps, for that time period. But yet George Washington was very supportive, and Mrs. Murray saw him as a personal friend, and she gave him a copy of the book. They exchanged letters, And she was also close friends, I might add, with the Adams, John and Abigail. Now, Exhibit B, religious tolerance. Now, this was not a tolerant time for religious beliefs. Take the Catholic faith. Now, I'm originally from the Boston area, and right now, the Roman Catholic Church is quite prominent there. It's quite common for people to be Roman Catholics, but in the Boston of the pre-revolution, there were almost no Catholics in Boston. And as a matter of fact, there was a very, very harsh anti-Catholic movement. As a matter of fact, they had this event, they called it Pope's Day, where they would burn the Pope in effigy. Now, when there was an invasion of Canada, and there were mostly troops from the Boston area involved in this invasion of Canada, General Washington at the time was very careful in his letters. He said, you are not to bother the Roman Catholics. You are to leave them alone, because he knew of this animosity and he did not want them to be persecuted. When he was president, I believe on more than one occasion, he attended a Roman Catholic service. Now, he was the kind of a man that deeds, not words. So he knew that it would be known that he went to a Roman Catholic service. And he knew that that would help in this unfortunate religious intolerance of the Roman Catholic faith. And then also too, when we think of the anti-Semitism, we are always drawn to, the Holocaust, the Second World War. But anti-Semitism is ancient. It goes very far back, and it was certainly present in the 18th century. Now, in my prepared remarks, I read a letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport, Rhode Island. I would encourage people, it's very easy to find. If you do an internet search, look up George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation at Rhode Island. It's a magnificent letter. And in it, he is very clear, as I shared an excerpt from it, that they were most welcome and that bigotry was not to be sanctioned. So there were those that can say many things about George Washington, but what is clear was that he was a proponent of religious tolerance, which was rare in many ways at that time. Now, Exhibit C, slavery itself. Now, it is clear that as a young man, he didn't give it a second thought. Now, that is the problem I see with people today, the inability to have yourself think as people thought at that time. So what is truly unique is for someone who thought nothing of slavery, because all Washington knew, it was a legal institution, for him to change. Now that is remarkable. Now you see this change starting to happen, first being economic. He realized that as a farmer, it was very expensive to maintain a slave population because a large portion could not work. You had the young children and you had the elderly. Now, Washington would take care of his slaves from cradle to grave and provide for them. So he said himself, it would be far less expensive than maintaining this slave population to hire day laborers. So he first thought about it economically. And then it was during the Fairfax Resolves that were set forth in 1774. It was then, that was the first time he clearly mentioned the evils of the slave trade. Now, what he was talking about at that point is the horror, as we all know now, the horrendous conditions that the slaves were brought to this country on these slave ships. I'm sure that it's very easy to get on the internet and see the horrors of that transatlantic trip. So there he was saying that he recognized the horrors and he wanted to end that. And then fast forward to the American Revolution, he was exposed to people that were very strongly opposed to slavery, very passionate. And this was new to him. He didn't have a lot of exposure to that previously. And there is a name that I want everyone to remember, and that is John Laurens of South Carolina. He was a passionate person against slavery from South Carolina. And sadly, he died. He was killed in an almost irrelevant battle at the very end of the war. Now, if he had lived, he would have been a huge force from the South talking against slavery. So now with Washington, if you served in the army, you had a place at his table. He respected you. So when these men who fought beside him came forward with these positions, it really caused him to think. And then you can see him progress, that as the war came to an end, as he got more involved in politics, you can see him struggling, that slavery was an evil. Slavery had to end. And he went through, I must say, some very complicated, almost unworkable solutions to ending slavery and his own personal property. But it finally came to a head. He had resigned from the presidency. I mean, he had completed his second term and he was once again a citizen. And he wrote out his will. And in his will, he specifically, the fancy name for it is manumission. He freed his slaves in his will. Now, this is critical because Washington understood that his life would be studied. He knew that people would study what he did. He was sending a message to the country in that will that slavery must end. And it must be remembered that he was the only founding father that owned slaves to free them in his will at his death. So it was a long process, but in the end, he did the right thing. So when people look at George Washington, I want them to think of exhibits A, exhibits B, exhibit C, to think, in a lot of ways, he was like a Renaissance man. I mean, yes, he was conservative in certain ways, but he was a free thinker in other ways. And I think it should be remembered that he deserves to have these statues in his honor. And without him, it's very possible that, there again, the great historian Thomas Flexner said that he called him the indispensable man. I believe that that's correct. Without him, I have my doubts that this country would have been started. But anyway, I hope that helps to answer that issue of slavery.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your talk this evening. It was wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Well, if there's any further information, I do have a website. It's called www.John Koopman III. It's all together. John Koopman, III, all together, no spaces.com. And in there, there's information about my book and other things that I've done as the general. And I just might say quickly that when I first started doing this in 2006, I thought at first, wow, I'm going to find all these things I don't want to find out. But I mean, yes, he had his flaws, but overall, the more I study the man, the more I'm amazed. He truly was a great man.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it, Mr. Koopman, and it was wonderful. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and good night. And we hope you join us again at future events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.